You believe you are a good person, right? But what if I told you that the line between good and evil is much thinner and much more fragile than you imagine?
That inside you, yes, inside you, exists the potential to become everything you fear the most. And even worse, you might already be becoming that person without even realizing it. In this video, we will explore how genuinely kind people can, little by little, transform into cold, selfish, even cruel beings. We are not talking about caricatured villains, but about silent, psychological transformations, often invisible, shaped by repression, by pride, by the illusion of superiority. With the help of Freud, Jung, Camus, and C.S. Lewis, we will dive into the mental mechanisms that corrupt even the best hearts. And more importantly, we will reveal how to resist before it's too late. Are you ready to look in the mirror and face the monster that might be growing inside you? If topics like psychology, philosophy, and the darkness of the human soul interest you, subscribe to the channel now. Repressed emotions never die. They are buried alive and will come forth later in uglier ways. There is something deeply unsettling in realizing that evil does not always arrive from the outside. It can be born from within. And most alarmingly, it can arise in those we least expect. Gentle, empathetic people, full of good intentions, begin, at some point, to behave in a cold, manipulative, even cruel way. But this transition is rarely drastic. It's not like flipping a switch. It's a process. Slow, subtle, almost imperceptible. And like every deep psychological process, it begins in the invisible, in the unspoken thoughts, the suppressed pains, the unprocessed frustrations. The monster doesn't walk through the front door. It germinates silently in the attic of the mind. Sigmund Freud argued that repression is one of the most dangerous forces in the psyche. Repressed emotions do not disappear. They shift, distort, and at some point in the future, resurface with disproportionate strength. That which is not integrated into consciousness begins to act from the shadows, shaping behaviors without us realizing it. A person who constantly represses their anger, for example, may at some point become passive-aggressive, sadistic, or emotionally manipulative, all while believing they are still good. Evil, in this case, does not arise from an explicit impulse, but from internal neglect, a failure to remain vigilant over one's own inner world. Carl Jung went further. For him, what we do not face in our shadow ends up becoming our destiny. In other words, what we do not recognize in ourselves, our selfish impulses, our desire for control, our will to destroy, ends up taking control of our actions without us knowing why. Good people become bad, often not because they consciously chose that path, but because they allowed repressed parts of the soul to take the wheel without resistance. That's why Jung claimed that shadow integration is essential, not to make us worse, but to prevent us from being ruled by what we pretend not to be. But not everything comes down to the individual unconscious. Albert Camus reminds us that the absurd, that feeling that life has no meaning, that suffering is gratuitous, can also plant dangerous seeds. When someone who is genuinely good starts to feel betrayed by life or ridiculed by society, kindness can turn into cynicism, justice into a desire for revenge, empathy into contempt. Evil, then, is born as a kind of response, a scream against the absurd. And thus, a once compassionate person begins to convince themselves that cruelty is a legitimate way to protect themselves, or to enact justice with their own hands. Therefore, the birth of the monster is not an external event. It is not a demon that invades the heart of man. It is an erosion, a progressive loss of connection with one's own values. It begins when we abandon self-reflection, when we stop questioning our motivations, when we start acting out of instinct, pride, or fear, and above all, when we begin to justify our small acts of selfishness with grand fantasies of goodness. The transformation is not always visible to others, but within the mind, the monster has already opened its eyes. Evil does not always appear as blatant brutality. Sometimes, It hides behind a kind smile, sweet words, loudly proclaimed good intentions. This is one of the most dangerous disguises evil can wear, the fantasy of goodness. C. Lewis, in the Screwtape Letters, warns that many human beings are lost, not because they become conscious monsters, but because they delude themselves into thinking they are still good, even when their actions already contradict everything they claim to believe. The mind creates a moral theater, and the ego settles into the role of the hero, even while performing small acts of cruelty. What Lewis reveals is brutal. The majority of people who become morally corrupted never realize it's happening. Why? Because they remain attached to an idealized image of themselves. They fantasize about grand gestures of love, justice, altruism, but those gestures are always in the future. They are always conditional. When I have more time, I'll help others. When everything is sorted out, I'll be a good person. And in the meantime, in the present, they ignore, humiliate, hurt. Goodness becomes an aesthetic project, a personal narrative, but not a lived practice. As Freud observed, we are more likely to deceive ourselves about what we feel than to face the naked truth of our impulses. This illusion is powerful because it satisfies the ego. It's easier to imagine oneself as a good person than to carry out, on a daily basis, acts of humility and empathy. Moral imagination offers comfort at no cost. Lewis precisely describes this phenomenon. The individual's mind is split between fantasy, where he is noble, generous, pure, and reality, where he acts out of convenience, pride, resentment. This division is the fertile ground of hypocrisy, but an unconscious hypocrisy, where the individual truly believes that their intentions are more important than their behaviors. And so, over time, the distance between who they are and who they believe they are becomes a chasm. This moral chasm is even more dangerous because it is invisible. Modern society, saturated with appearances and carefully constructed images, reinforces this process. Social media, public masks, rehearsed speeches, all invite the individual to maintain an image of goodness. But that image becomes a substitute for real virtue. And the more perfect the fantasy, the harder it is to see the truth. A man who believes himself to be just may commit injustices in the name of righteousness. A woman who believes herself to be compassionate may act with selective cruelty, justifying her disdain as honesty. Goodness becomes aesthetic, but not ethical. That is why the art of illusion is not just a mistake. It is a danger, because the more we fall in love with the idea that we are good, the less space we give to the possibility of self-criticism. And without self-criticism, there is no growth. Without humility, there is no redemption. The fantasy of goodness can become a golden prison, where the individual lives convinced of their purity, while their surroundings deteriorate. And the worst part, when confronted with the reality of their own evil, this individual may reject the truth so forcefully that they would rather embrace absolute cynicism, because to admit failure would destroy the illusion that sustained their identity. And for many, that is unbearable. The most dangerous evil is not the one that is screamed, it's the one that is whispered, the one that hides. The one that is suffocated behind smiles, dogmas, and good manners. Carl Jung called this the shadow, the dark side of the personality. Everything we repress, deny, or pretend doesn't exist within us. But what is repressed does not disappear. It accumulates. It waits. And eventually, it finds a way to express itself, often in the worst possible way. This is how good people, who spent their lives trying to suppress their most primitive instincts, can explode into violence, selfish, or destructive behaviors without even understanding what drove them. Repression is treacherous because it disguises itself as virtue. A man who learned from an early age that he must not feel anger convinces himself that he is calm, mature, controlled. But that anger does not dissolve. It hides. It transforms into sarcasm, into manipulation, into passive cruelty. Women taught to always be gentle and pleasing may accumulate so much frustration that, eventually, their kindness turns into poison. A cold, calculated poison disguised as courtesy. Freud stated that the return of the repressed is inevitable. What is not accepted and worked through in the conscious mind returns through the unconscious with disproportionate force. And here lies the cruel paradox. The more someone believes they are too good to feel anger, envy, lust, or the desire for control, the more vulnerable they are to being dominated by those feelings. Because denying the shadow does not weaken it. It strengthens it. It grows in the dark. And when it emerges, it does so violently because it has been silenced for too long. Jung said, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. And it is precisely this refusal to look within that transforms good people into agents of evil, not out of intention, but out of ignorance of themselves. C.S. Lewis also understood this mechanism. In his letters, the demon Screwtape advises his patient to never think about deep moral issues, to stay distracted, superficial, because it is in the absence of reflection that the shadow grows. When we stop confronting our own dark impulses, we also stop controlling them. They then begin to govern our thoughts, decisions, and attitudes under the guise of rationality. We justify petty acts as deserved, cruel words as sincerity, contempt as self-defense. And little by little, evil becomes a habit, everyday, invisible. What begins as emotional repression ends as dehumanization, first of ourselves, then of others. After all, those who do not recognize their own pain do not recognize the pain of others. Those who do not accept their own anger cannot understand the anger of others. The ignored shadow separates us from empathy, separates us from reality, and ultimately separates us from our own humanity. Good people become evil, many times, not out of malice, but from internal disintegration, from refusing the call of individuation, that painful but essential process of knowing and integrating all parts of the soul, even the darkest ones. No evil flourishes alone. It needs fertile soil, and that soil is often the social environment. C.S. Lewis, in the Screwtape Letters, masterfully exposes how demons do not try to destroy man directly, but rather shape his surroundings. Because, with the right environment, the individual himself digs his downfall, and does so with a smile on his face, believing he is merely adapting. The truth is uncomfortable. We are social creatures, and no matter how convinced we are of our values, they can silently bend before the approval of others. Imagine a man who attends church, who calls himself compassionate, just, but now he finds himself surrounded by sophisticated, cynical people who mock everything he used to defend. Slowly, not wanting to seem naive, he begins to laugh along. Then, he starts to repeat some phrases, softens his stances, until, without realizing it, his moral identity is compromised. As Jung said, excessive adaptation to the environment is a form of betrayal of the soul. And that's exactly what happens. The soul bows to collective pressure, and consciousness dissolves into the crowd. Social contagion is so effective because it is rarely perceived as a threat. The seduction is not explicit. It comes disguised as friendship, as recognition, as belonging. And who doesn't want to belong? Screwtape understands this perfectly. He advises that the patient get close to a high social group, where virtue is ridiculed as sentimentalism. The man, wanting to be accepted, begins to dilute his principles and calls it maturity. But this is not growth. It is erosion. It is moral decay disguised as sophistication. Freud would say there is an unconscious pleasure in all of this. The pleasure of abandoning individual responsibility and merging with the herd. It is easier to be cool when everyone around you applauds. It is easier to judge, exclude, humiliate when the group legitimizes evil. Hannah Arendt called this the banality of evil. Terror does not need grand monsters, but ordinary people doing what everyone else is doing, simply because that is the climate of the moment. And so one of the most frightening mechanisms of moral corruption is revealed: internal division. The individual begins to live in two worlds, one where he maintains the appearance of goodness, and another where he practices socially accepted evil. He prays in church but despises the poor at dinner. He speaks of justice but stays silent in the face of his friend's injustice. This division is not just hypocrisy, it is alienation from the soul itself. Lewis shows that when this split continues, the person forgets what is right or wrong. All that remains is what is convenient. And that is where the true tragedy begins. The environment corrupts, but it is the individual who surrenders. No one becomes malevolent overnight. It is a process, a series of concessions, a slight detour here, another there, until one day, the person looks at themselves and no longer recognizes who they are. The mirror does not reflect the face of who they thought they were, only the mask they built themselves, brick by brick, through the gaze of others. That is why the choice of who we walk with, what discourses we expose ourselves to, what values we give a stage to, is a moral choice. Evil doesn't need to convince us. It only needs to numb us. It only needs to leave us so immersed in an environment of mediocrity, cynicism, and vanity that we start to believe this is normal. And when the abnormal becomes the new normal, the conscience falls asleep and evil thrives. In the end, the battle is not between good people and bad people. It is between two forces within each of us. It is not about the other who becomes corrupted, but about the self who is slowly corrupted or resists. The question that echoes then is there salvation? Is it possible to turn back after so many small moral betrayals? Or, as in Milton's Paradise Lost, is there only to reign in hell? Cease. Lewis responds with an unexpectedly humble image, and precisely because of that, a powerful one. Salvation is not in grand gestures, nor in heroic virtues, but in ordinary goodness. In the man who prays only for strength to be good in the next few hours. In the woman who chooses to silence cruelty, even if no one is watching. In the small decisions that, when added together, form a character. The road to heaven, he says, is made of the same small stones that pave hell, but in the opposite direction. This idea is revolutionary because it takes the focus off the spectacle. It shows that one does not need to be a saint or a martyr. One needs to be conscious. And consciousness, that fragile yet living flame, is what can rescue us. Freud had already shown that what does not become conscious becomes destiny. In other words, if we do not recognize the evil that dwells within us, it will dominate us, and we will call it bad luck, a mistake, or say, the world is like this. But if we recognize it, if we look it in the face, with courage, then we have a chance. Jung called this individuation, the painful process of integrating the shadow, of uniting the fragmented parts of the self, of ceasing to live like a ghost and becoming a whole being. And this demands a choice that does not happen once in a lifetime, but every day. In every thought we nurture, every word we speak, every impulse we choose to follow or resist. Ruin happens in the abandonment of vigilance. In that instant when we stop asking ourselves, is this right? And begin to ask only, does this work? Lewis shows that demons do not need to destroy anyone directly. They only need to encourage frivolity, the easy laugh, the disdain for truth. Because true evil does not scream, it whispers, it numbs. It convinces us that we are good, while we move further and further away from real goodness. But there is a way out. There is a point of return, even after everything, even when we no longer recognize ourselves. Because consciousness, if cultivated, can be rekindled. Because goodness, no matter how silent it may seem, has an indestructible force. It does not demand perfection. It demands presence, choice, intention. To be good is not to never err. It is not to get used to error. It is not to turn the fall into a dwelling place. At the end of the screw tape letters, the patient escapes the demon's clutches, not because he won an epic war, but because he made, in the final moment, a sincere choice. Because he sought something greater than himself, and that redeems him. Because, as Lewis says, it is not too late to change. Never. So, how do good people become bad? They do not wake up one day and decide to destroy the world. They get lost slowly. They get distracted. They adapt. They fall silent. They make concessions so small they seem harmless, until the accumulation of those crumbs of moral negligence turns into an abyss. And when they look back, they realize they have already crossed the line, not because they wanted to, but because they stopped choosing. But here's the crucial point. If evil is built step by step, so is good. And true strength lies in silent vigilance, in choosing daily what is right, even when no one is watching, in resisting inner fragmentation and fighting for a whole soul. You do not need to be perfect, but you do need to be awake. Some think this was the end, but be careful. The war is not over yet. There are still things left unsaid. These 2 videos in front of you are not here by chance. And what if everything you believe about yourself is just a reflection of someone else's gaze? Click now on one of the videos beside you and start breaking that mirror. You will have to risk the click. So, which one will you choose? If this resonated with you, if at any moment you felt that something inside you is also fighting to remain whole, then subscribe to the channel now. Here, philosophy meets psychology, and together we will uncover the deepest layers of the self. Activate the bell, because the next episodes will challenge you and maybe even transform you. See you in the darkness or in the light. The choice is yours.